Witam serdecznie na drugim z wykładów profesora Thomasa Micalema. Nazywam się Wojciech Udala i reprezentuję katowicki oddział Stowarzyszenia Architektów Polskich. Wykład jest częścią programu zatytułowanego Wspólnie innowacyjnej dydaktyki przyszłości oraz doskonałości naukowej. Projekt międzynarodowej współpracy z profesorem Thomasem Micalem z Instytut University of Technology. Beneficjentami programu są zarówno pracownicy wspomnianego instytutu, jak i studenci prowadzeni przez Instytut Kierunków Studiów, Kulturoznawstwa oraz Kultur Mediów. Uczestniczą w nim ponadto pracownicy naukowi oraz studenci Wydziału Architektury Politechniki Śląskiej w Gliwicach. Inicjatywa uzyskała dofinansowanie Górnośląsko-Zagłębiowskiej Metropolii w ramach programu Metropolitalny Fundusz Wspierania Nauki w latach 2019-2022. Dzisiejsze spotkanie, w przeciwieństwie do poprzedniego, będzie podzielone na dwie części. W pierwszej z nich profesor Thomas Micalem wygłosi wykład zatytułowany Architektoniczna inteligencja i zwielokrotnione ekologie. Natomiast po jego zakończeniu zapraszamy Was na dyskusję z udziałem gości specjalnych. Japońskiego architekta Takaharo Tezuki, słoweńsko-holenderskiej artystki Agnes Momirski oraz Małgorzaty Kącieli, reprezentującej Wydział Humanistyczny Uniwersytetu Śląskiego. Poza Uniwersytetem Śląskim współorganizatorami dzisiejszego wydarzenia są Politechnika Śląska i katowicki oddział Stowarzyszenia Architektów Polskich, który reprezentuję. Natomiast patronem medialnym wydarzenia jest miesięcznik Architektura i Biznes. Oczywiście przez cały czas trwania transmisji na żywo zachęcamy Was do zadawania pytań w komentarzach. Po zakończeniu wykładu oraz dyskusji zadamy je profesorowi Micalowi i pozostałym gościom. Now I'm very happy to introduce you our today's guest lecturer. Hello, Thomas. I hope that you are well.
I'm doing well, thank you.
Thomas Micalem is a professor of architectural theory. He has conducted research and classes in broadly understood design, as well as many courses in media and culture studies to support the advanced design education and the problems of artificial intelligence. Today, he's going to give a lecture entitled Architectural Intelligence and Multiple Ecologies, where he's going to touch the topic of synthesis of architecture with other disciplines. I think that it sounds extremely interesting, so please welcome Professor Thomas Micalem.
Great, thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. Metropolitan sponsoring us for these presentations, and I'm very interested in sharing some ideas that I have about how we operate or can operate with ideas of multiplicity, both in terms of our understanding of how we see and move through the world, and also the understanding of how the world itself is composed, perhaps, of multiple ecologies. What I hope to do today is to show some examples in a related field of design, nature, aesthetics, and some even architecture and urban design, and to show some projects and some ideas and some elements from history and some interesting stories that will hopefully entangle and bring together the idea of thinking and the idea of sensing in relationship to the world considered as dynamic processes. So if you allow me to load my presentation, I will be speaking the presentation with some images as the primary source. Okay, and here we go. Consider this insect and how this insect is seeing the world at this particular moment. This insect has a set of compound eyes, multiple eyes that all are slightly different in their orientation. They synthesize data coming and streaming from the real world in real time into the optics and gets transformed into signals processed through the brain that then get interpreted. This insect, as an early riser, is also encumbered by some other lenses on top of their biological lenses, the morning dew. You can see how the nature photographer has captured the exact moment when the dew or water from the plants in the nearby proximity have adhered to the eyes. This is an insect whose compound eyes are synthesized, but also whose compound eyes are layered with a different type of lens. Each of those little globes of water magnify, distort, or transform the signals coming in. At the same time, none of them obscure the outside world. A lens is simply a device for distortion, and the distortions can allow us to understand what is around us. And if we think phenomenologically, the lenses give attention to those areas where we are not distorted. These create different subtleties of difference that can be passively or actively synthesized in the nervous system. As such, maybe we are each like this insect, used to or accustomed to seeing the world in our particular viewpoint, our subject position, our way of seeing and understanding the world, and that based on the local climatic conditions, the local microecologies, the local climate, these can be modified or transformed. At a conceptual level also, if we think about how we are accustomed to seeing the world through our conventional lenses, we can always add other lenses, mechanical, biological, virtual, and with these other lenses, we can learn to see the world in a different way as well. For that reason, the world is always potentially multiple, in the same way that we are composed of the potential to see the world in multiple ways. I'd like to talk about the very important topic of worlds within worlds. This is a topic that has places in literature, in myth, in science fiction, in indigenous studies, in a whole range of different knowledge practices and artistic creative processes. The idea of constructing a world within a world could be anything from a utopia to a small experimental environment in a small jar. The idea of the world within worlds has something to do about a reciprocal relationship. The insect that we have just seen sees the world reciprocally through itself. It is in the world, but also observing the world. In the case of worlds within worlds, we have a spatial or a conceptual model of something that is perforated, of something that is composed of some openings, of the possibility of a little piece of the world being separated and transformed. And I would like to talk about this concept of the worlds within worlds because it helps us understand the starting positions for creating multiplicities. Think about one of those drops of water on the eye of the insect. If you look in very closely using a different lens, the microscope, this is what you would perhaps see in the drop of water. You would see different creatures, different animals, different plants, perhaps pieces and fragments of the built environment. Too small to see to our unaided eye, but once we zoom in close enough, once we use a type of mechanical lens, we can start to see an entire world within a drop of water. This water drop contains within it an ecology, a very, very tiny ecology, something that is fragile. And it's also dynamic. It's composed of dynamic processes and spontaneous systems organizing. You have prey and predators. You have elements of great beauty. And all of these are operating at a level far beyond our ability to perceive naturally, but they still operate as an ecology, as a world. This world in the drop connects to other worlds. The elements within it are in an unstable relationship to each other. It's like a field condition. The elements within it can distort, manipulate, proliferate, disappear. As such, these operations or agents are never in a fixed or permanent situation. Everything seems to be in flow. Everything seems to be in process. The drop of water itself is part of a larger system of water and hydraulics, even touching at a global scale. But the global scale of the circulation of water as a chemical is here turned into something else through natural processes. It becomes an environment. It's an invisible, microscopic environment that still is filled with all of the vitality, all of the processes, and is ready to be understood as a type of model of how things interact, even at this infinitely small scale. There are great examples in the history of art and of creative industries of imagining alternative worlds. We can imagine a time before time. We can imagine a time in the distant future. We can imagine a world that exists almost, but not quite perceptibly, touching at a point of tangency with our world. In this example, one of my favorite paintings by Hieronymus Bosch in the museum in Madrid, we can see the central panel of a triptych presenting something like an alternative narrative to the foundation of the world. Here it is not the Garden of Eden with its forbidden tree of knowledge, but also tree of life. What we have here in the Garden of Earthly Lights is an alternative history, an alternative narrative of how nature and mankind coexist. It is an alternative narrative that presents the whole range of human emotions and feelings, plus also a post-humanist position is articulated here, where the fundamental distinction between human and non-human is consistently being transgressed and subverted. Plants, animals, minerals, and human all interact and in many ways frolic and play. They move from their normal positions into frivolous or exciting or even sometimes controversial relationships. We can see different forms of adventure and different forms of joy being played out as processes in this environment. You can see the overriding geometry, the centralized sphere, the square leading to the four corners of the earth, and those four corners being marked by something that contains animals, vegetables, and minerals that recall perhaps complex alchemical systems or even surreal worlds within worlds. In this tableau, in this milo, in this representation of a world that is different but close to ours, in that proximity, we can also see the possibility and potential of how our world could be different. We see here an alternative humanity, and we also see an alternative ecology. Nature here is one of many parts interacting and being dynamically created and composed in relationship to the stories that are unfolding through the interaction of the different animals, the different species, the different situations and places. We can see in this process other processes. And maybe this is the most fascinating part about thinking about worlds within worlds. The complexity, the overwhelming interconnectedness of different systems, the culture of crisis and risk that has come to our attention, particularly now. All of these expose sometimes difficult issues that might be too large to address, problems that are too wicked to solve. But even in the smallest scale, even in creative representations slightly separated from the world, we can still see that bristling tension of potentials and possibilities. There is latent within all of these different aspects hope. And if you read this painting as a principle of an alternative start for the world, we can also see the element of faith and the element of hope becoming playfulness and joy and adventure. This lets me think about ways of situating processes of creation and how those creative processes, to understate it, allow us to transform the world. Often we will do this piece by piece, element by element. In this sculpture, you can see how different fragments of utopian visions of childhood, of playfulness, of joy get reinterpreted into an assemblage, a collage perhaps in 3 dimensions of different elements tethered together, each amongst themselves either a fragment or a component, an element or a memory of some other place. This reassemblage of different elements or fragments into new propositions, into new wholes, is the same creative process that we saw in Bosch. It's the creation of a new world from memories and fragments of the current. And what's also interesting in this case is the possibility, as many people are doing now in many creative industries, of looking to what exists around us, what might be seen as old or obsolete or waste or marginal, abject or discarded, and how to find new uses, how to invent new purposes, how to create and invent, fascinating, interesting, sometimes even strange assemblages that allow us to rethink the possibility of the future and to situate the transformation as a basis of creativity and to put transformation at the basis of our lived environments. We can think of the world and how we influence the world, even something as subtle as how we move, what we eat, what we watch, what media we consume will have implications, a cascade effect in the local environment and the larger environment. So this lets me think about a project of great importance, particularly in the contemporary times, about the different forms of intelligence that have been identified and are being identified, and how these can be brought to bear on different opportunities and different situations. And it's one of my axiomatic positions that people are not singular entities with one singular, fully integrated, holistic, functioning mind, but the theory of mind that I follow draws from process philosophy, theories of multiplicity, and theories of multiple intelligences. In this process, it says that we are always in formation, that we are projects unto ourselves, not worlds separated from the world, but we are in the process organically of growing, exploring, and transforming. And this occurs in multiple levels, in multiple registers. And I'll try to explain a little bit of the ideas behind where multiple intelligences came from and why it helps us understand the world in a very different way. Gardner in the 1980s came up with a proposition that the human intelligence is actually layered and diverse, that within us, as Walt Whitman said, we contain multitudes. One of the consequences of this is that there are different types of intelligence in this theory that correspond to different attitudes and different ways of looking at the world. This idea of multiple intelligences is founded on the principle that each person has within them some component or some elements of this. You can see everything from bodily kinesthetic to musical to both intra and interpersonal skills, even linguistic. So some people will have strengths in one area or a natural gift in one area, but they will never have a full set of, maximum capacity in all of the different areas. And as a consequence, everyone is in a process of changing and evolving because of this. Some people's strengths are other people's weaknesses, and that's okay too. The theory of multiple intelligences was actually closer to a understanding of skills and abilities and less directly drawn from empiricist studies of cognitive science, which were not quite at that level back then in the 80s when these theories were being developed. As a consequence of this, we have a greater range of understandings of the different ways of being in the world. Each of these stands for or marks a different way of existing, and as well as interpreting. And each of these would give us like a different lens, a new way of understanding how the world works. As a consequence of this, if we understand this idea that we are composed of multiple intelligences, it means we can also prioritize, or in some ways we can grow in the areas that we wish to grow. To put it very simply, you can think of yourself as well. Some of you will be very good at logic or mathematics, some at linguistics, some at music, some at thinking spatially and moving spatially. Some will have a strong bodily or kinesthetic movement and understanding of the world. Some will have a strength in natural environments and understanding ecologies. Interpersonal, having to do with your emotional intelligence, it's called now, and intrapersonal, which has to do more with your understanding of the depths and layers within yourself. He also nominated, in his later work, other types of intelligences, which actually get more into worldviews or paradigms, spiritual, existential, and moral. These, as you can see, can be thought of as kaleidoscopic. You can think of, for example, the way that a prism would break a band of white light into multiple colors. Use the example of musical intelligence to highlight and illustrate this multiplicity model. Some of the most innovative work done in music occurred in the interplay in the golden era of jazz between Miles Davis and John Coltrane. You couldn't have found two musicians more different from each other. Miles Davis, known well for his ability to focus very extensively on permutations, but also having a very distant relationship to the music and the discipline, as opposed to Coltrane. Coltrane had a very, very focused and disciplined, almost monastic approach towards the creation of new works. Davis was more the experimenter in terms of freestyle, and even famously would leave in the middle of a performance to go sit in the audience and observe the band before coming back to play. Coltrane himself would experiment and play in an iterative way to finally refine phrases, signatures. Davis would do hypothetical problems. Coltrane would discipline and craft the sound until it was nearly perfect. And these two different approaches towards music are both a heightened form of intelligence, a disciplinary skill bound into their lifestyles, bound into their worldview, wired, as it were, into their neural systems. It's the interplay between these two types of musical intelligence, of many types of musical intelligence, that created some of the most significant work in jazz. And it's fascinating to read their biographies and their history and also listen to the music. Two people performing at the same time in the same place with these very different attitudes both functioning at a high level of disciplinary skill, operated in such different ways. So this means within Gardner's theory, I believe, that even those different forms of multiple intelligences that we have as latent capacities, as possibilities, they themselves can be as unique as we are too. I mentioned before emotional intelligence, and emotional intelligence is increasingly seen, particularly in the business world, as one of the most important areas for understanding how to be successful in social relationships. Emotional intelligence is at the core of a lot of what is nowadays called the soft skills in terms of everything from social interaction to politics. The ability to read someone else through their emotions, to read subtle clues or cues in their manner, in their attitude, in their behavior, to pick up and to empathize, in particular to sit in the shoes of another or to look through the eyes of another, is a very, very important aspect of emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence is the fundamental ability to leap the distance between two bodies or two minds and to work in some sort of harmony or resonance, not simply mirroring the gestures, but understanding the world from a different point of view. This type of intelligence allows you to project consequences, the feelings that others would have potentially in the future, and can act as a very strong motivator for your ability to discern and navigate through the social world, not the environmental world. Emotional intelligence is often underrated or seen in some ways as a lesser skill than, say, mathematics or spatial skills. But according to Gardner's theories and his followers, none of the skills are more superior or more valuable themselves. Everybody has different capacities and different possible outcomes for those different types of intelligence, and each of them can be developed. It goes against the idea of inherited genius and a lot of romanticist ideas about art or creativity. And it places greater emphasis perhaps on the idea of development and growth. Even emotional intelligence can be learned. Another area of development that's happened since I've been doing work in design and design thinking has to do with this idea of neurodiversity. Neurodiversity recognizes that the different types of cognitive processes and the different types of affects, the different types of cognitive disorders, the different types of eccentricities, we shall say, that occur within the spectrum of human thought patterns and human mental processes is actually itself reaffirming. There cannot be, in neurodiversity, a singular, privileged, correct way to do things or to think things or to even optimize your mental performance. Neurodiversity is the recognition that some people do see things in a very different way. Sometimes it is used as a way to describe aspects of the autistic spectrum or to classify disorders. But what neurodiversity does for mental processes and paradigms and cognitive science is what superdiversity does for linguistics. Superdiversity talks about that Tower of Babel situation where there's so many people, each speaking and operating in a different tongue. But also you can think about it thinking and processing information in very different ways. If we followed the idea of multiple intelligences, it means that there's an inherent plasticity to our intellectual ability and growth. And we know, particularly with smaller children, that neuroplasticity is something that is most active through the earliest years. The greater range of experiences that you have earlier in your life, the more the neuroplasticity will allow you to receive and to understand the situations and the sensory data in later life. Neurodiversity, and this illustration from a newspaper, accidentally or maybe intentionally plays on an old, witticism from the Bauhaus. Neurodiversity is a spectrum of ways of being in the world intellectually and cognitively, and none of them are definitive in the sense that they are forced to, or they force you to stay in the same state forever. The case of the Bauhaus, the entrance exam for the Bauhaus, was actually a very simple test, according to anecdote. You would be given a paper with a square, a circle, and a triangle, and a yellow, blue, and red crayon, and be told to correctly assign the color that matches the shape. You can see the answers here. But you were also given an opportunity to explain why. So the triangle, which is the most pointed, is the most dynamic and red is the most dynamic color. The blue is stable. It is, like their sphere of water, intact and whole, and the blue does that as well. And the yellow is something that has aspirations and movement in certain dimensions, but it also marks out a clear space, and yellow is that effect too. So even in this type of forced kinesthesia, even in this entrance exam that they claim was part of the Bauhaus, we can start to see how different people in this illustration, this little anecdotal cartoon, accidentally touches upon something very significant that's just starting to be researched. That different types of neurodiversity each have a way of being high performing and transformative in different disciplines or in different processes within the working world, the social world, and the creative industries. So this takes me to the idea and the construct of architectural intelligences. It's not something I invented, and it's not something that is unique to my work, but it is a common term nowadays that plays on the idea of artificial intelligence and the different types of organic learning systems there, as well as the way that they get transcoded or translated into machinic learning and different models around that, whether they're in some ways increasing in their flexibility or plasticity, or if they simply just become more efficient. There's a lot of research and there's a lot of, I think, grand claims made for artificial intelligence, the way 10 years ago everyone thought clouds were going to save all of us. But the consequence of thinking about artificial intelligence is that it also probably has severe limitations in those cognitive processes, in those higher order thinking systems, and in those other ways of being and sensing and understanding the world that cannot be as easily described or defined, particularly through binary logic or codes. With this idea, I play with the idea of architectural intelligence as both a commentary on artificial intelligence, but also something that, like Gardner's theory of intelligence, plays more on the silences around it. Excuse me a second. If we look at architectural intelligences, we can see in this image the sculpture by Juan Ortega. In this sculpture, we have an exploded axonometric. And this is a type of drawing that is known to architects, but being reinserted here as a sculpture. This sculpture is presented as a representation in 2 dimensions and 3 dimensions, because in architectural drawing, we would take things apart. In taking things apart, we start to see how they're put together. In doing that, we can start to see how, by pulling them together, they can operate as components that can be reassembled. Because of this, we start to see in Juan Ortega's work something like an architectural intelligence, where understanding assemblage, understanding processes of making, production, desire, all interact. This Volkswagen Beetle, a conventional vehicle for driving around in Mexico City, where he came from in Mexico, is now hung in the museum as a sculpture, as a work of art. Architectural intelligence is a way of thinking about how things are put together and can be taken apart, but also reassembled. Here we can see advanced technology and manufacturing pulled into pieces and then brought back together, or potentially reassembled in unusual or provocative ways too. This recombinant ability, this idea of thinking through processes forward and back, this ability to substitute, replace, or shift different parts of the elements back into new positions or old positions, is a way of creativity. It's also just a way of free play, but it also can have scientific precision if you're trying to solve a problem. Architectural intelligence is a type of disciplinary processes, which includes codes, protocols, and techniques that allow us to think about how to make things, disassemble them, reassemble them, and produce something new from existing matter. Think of a transformer. The transformer is a device that has 2 states, a closed and an open, animalistic and machinic. And their interplay or interchange is dependent on a set of operations. As the truck or as the car rotates, transforms, expands, and moves along different axes into a fundamental three-dimensional change of state towards a humanoid robot. We can see in the idea of the transformer some of the fundamental mechanics of the earliest theories of imagination. And imagination is often seen as a reservoir or a vault filled with memories, but also we can understand the processes now and how we can turn A into B. The fundamental challenge for everything from alchemy to theology, how to transform something from state A to state B, can be seen in a very mechanized and mechanical way, but we can also see it as a process of joy and playfulness. Architectural Intelligence is also the name of a book series that I've started to look at how architecture draws from and can use ideas from other disciplines and create a dialogue or a play. In this way, it's not a change of state of something from condition A to condition B, but it is a dialogue. How do A and B produce new combinations? How can architectural knowledge, the knowledge of bodies in space, and the knowledge of temporal sequences and processes, how can this combine with areas such as philosophy, cognitive science? How can it combine with nature studies? How can it combine with material studies? How can it combine with poetry and myth? So for me, the idea of architectural intelligence is, if you want to look at the book series we started, looks at that interplay between one discipline and another to create an interdisciplinary type of knowledge. Because one thing about architectural intelligence that is important is that it pulls together new knowledge, new practices, new codes, even new routines or technologies into the conventions to make them unconventional. Consider, for example, these shows from the Metropolitan Museum in New York City. These are examples of dresses on exhibition at the Costume Institute. And what's happening here is something transformative. If you look at these dresses, you may even question the boundaries of how is this clothing? What is interesting in terms of the pedagogy behind this as it applies to our work in design schools is that these dresses have been constructed without using scissors, templates, or sewing machines. These dresses are 3D printed and they can be customized. They can be tested, transformed, modified virtually through digital design, then sent to the printers, and the printers can 3D print or assemble them, and then they can be used. This transformation in automation that produces new ways of creating things was also anticipated in the Bauhaus. The Bauhaus turned towards abstraction, towards simple forms, and towards machinic repetition. We're now seeing a transformation happening again in so-called Industry 4.0, where new modes of production and manufacture and design, not simply automated, but imaginative, by drawing in different disciplines, allow us to work with everything from making clothing out of mushrooms and organic matter, to making clothing that functions as media and transforms instantly or produces data, to clothing that can be high performing along a whole range of different attributes. When you're learning to be an architect or a designer, you're often asked to do a definitive capstone project. At the end of your studies, you will do a thesis or have a dissertation, often with a creative component and a written or theoretical component. When I was supervising thesis students at Carleton University in Canada, we expected each student to come up with a proposition or something they can test. Now, there was an interesting debate that happened at the time because some of the scholars and some of the designers thought that architecture should be more like a science. And because of that one should test a hypothesis. One should have a testable, provable, or disprovable hypothesis, and therefore the thesis process would become a hypothesis. Others, coming from art, thought that there was no such thing as establishing a true-false binary. And those who thought architecture belonged to art would often talk about in terms of expression, subjectivity, and feeling or affect. The third model that emerged from this debate was that you can neither prove or disprove the truth of a work of design, nor can you simply operate with design as a type of aesthetic subjectivity. That between them was something that was different. It was neither true, false, nor both and, but design was something like a type of demonstration. that you would propose something. You would combine or assemble different pieces. And here you can see 3 different thesis students of mine who each made their thesis project about combining or recombining things that normally don't belong together to come up with new ways of starting to make architecture. This kind of recombinant imagination, recombinant intelligence processes are the basis, I would argue, for a lot of the innovations that happen in the design aspects of architecture. So you have architecture not functioning at that early tender phase of the students developing their own language, where the thesis is a type of solo flight or their first foray into designing a project all the way through. We can't quite say that architecture is a science, and we can't say it's simply an art. We have to acknowledge that design has an entirely different set of rules, somewhere between but also separate from the science-art spectrum. So back to Bosch. We tried to do here, and this was when I was visiting at the Architectural Association in London, and we were working on transforming the curriculum of a design school as a hypothetical new curriculum. The curriculum was composed in the conventional design programs, many in the United States, including the ones I was working at, towards a sequence of design studios as the primary laboratory for instruction, with the studio pedagogy being a unique, unreproducible situation of collective learning by project-based speculation and recursive iterative processes. We reconsidered those as design ecologies, not simply design projects, but as ecologies, where even the laboratory and the outsiders that came in to help with the projects were part of that local ecology, ecology of thought, as well as ecology of means and materials. We took all of the representation courses, which are often called support courses and increasingly lead towards software development, and reconsidered those in light of the field of media ecologies, which is a fascinating field started by Marshall McLuhan and extended even into the media philosophy that I studied at the European Graduate School. We have different technology courses, hard tech and soft tech, engineering, lighting, even building mechanics, called built ecologies now. And then all of the other support courses having to do with the human-centered design approaches and the wider cultural connotation, we bundled them together along with urban history as urban ecologies. So what we did was we tried to reconsider the entire curriculum for the design school in terms of layered ecologies, like you would find, say, in this imaginary ecology of Bosch of the medieval surrealist mode, or the layered ecologies you might find in a rainforest, where the operations at the ground level are entirely different from those at the top of the trees. So what are design ecologies? Let's go back to earlier forms of representation and talk about Goethe in particular, where the beautiful is a manifestation of secret laws of nature, which, but for this phenomenon, would have remained hidden to us forever. Nature was the explicit point of reference for transformation in the origins of modern design. Ernst Haeckel in his illustrations represented different physical forms of mysterious but honestly commonplace creatures, and did them in an artistic way, almost as pattern books. Here you can see different sorts of jellyfish, different sorts of organic forms being stylized. Each of these organisms existed in a real place and were drawn and documented as if they were patterns isolated from their context and shown in their mute and perhaps fossilized situation. Here we have something that's closer to collecting, and nature at that time was often thought of, in these jellyfish, for example, as a symbol or as an icon. And by that, I mean that the actual natural processes of these organic creatures were frozen in time in these representations, almost as its sculptures or as collections. This turn towards nature and the organic started to destabilize what is the common narrative of modernism and modernity towards a technological determinism and a utopianism. What that means is, as the world became increasingly industrialized, people often placed greater faith in industrialization and bureaucracy and technical solutions. But we start to see that starting to destabilize when many of the artists and designers who are moving away from the conventions in the turn of the 1900 last century moved towards something like Art Nouveau, where the stylized version of nature broke from an idea of a mechanized world and talked about an alternative future and an alternative present. Art Nouveau, for this reason, places stylized nature at the center of the aesthetic project as a means of recovering other aspects of the human condition and the natural world into an increasingly mechanized world. Darcy Thompson's book on growth and form tried to mathematically, and you can see here, describe the forms of transformations. Before there were transformers, there were grids. And these grids, if you look at the different types of fish shown, are mathematical descriptors after the fact, showing how two different species of fish, not just from a common ancestor, but optically can be considered as mathematical transformations. It oversimplifies also the function and the performance and the environment of the fish and sees it as an object with clear proportions. We can also see this logic in the taxonomies that people make about industrialization, and that there are something like perhaps primitive ancestors for all the different formal permutations that we will find. We can also think about the richness and the incredible complexity of the world. Most of the species in the world are actually insects and not mammals. And this is an illustration from a place I went once with small children. My son, Peter Parker Michael, was quite obsessed about some of these insects, just millions of beetles collected and arranged at the insectarium in the Botanical Gardens in Montreal. In this environment, you can see every possibility you would imagine of beetle shells. But there's millions more that don't exist anymore, and there's millions more that haven't evolved yet. And in this richness and this plentitude and this great diversity, we can start to see how nature was such a compelling source for design thinking and design inspiration in the period of mechanization. Perhaps that fascination with nature has never disappeared, even though our attitude towards nature collectively is changing and will change again. What we see here in this plentitude, in this multiplicity of beetles, is infinite possibilities. And again, as a consequence of that, the multiples give us a sense of joy, or a sense of liberation, a sense of freedom. None of these beetles can transpose or switch their lives with the other beetles, but in looking at them from this point of view, we can start to understand all that might be possible. And in that process, we start to understand something that many artists and designers and scientists who have studied nature come to realize, that all of the variations point us towards a greater understanding of how each piece, each element is important in the environment and the context it comes from. There's something quite unnatural about this artificial environment, and there's something quite unnatural about collecting all of them and using them as a tile pattern. But there's also something fascinating in looking at them. Consider in contrast how we look at nature today, particularly in the design fields. This jellyfish that lives deep in the ocean and has no access to sunlight is not even a single organism, as Haeckel would have us believe. Its stinging nettles, its enclosure, its translucent enclosure, its digestive system are all different species that have bundled together and create an organism of different origins that is able to live and reproduce and exist in the ocean. And it is also part of a process. It grows, it changes, it hunts, and it is hunted. It is in an environment where everything from sunlight to water chemistry to the seasons all influence its movement and behaviors in ways that can be measured and tested. As a consequence, when we design based on ecology as opposed to nature, ecologies predispose us to think about interrelationships, interconnections, interdependencies, and to think about how different things move in and through each other. We can also imagine how this plays out in artistic practice. In bioart, for example, scientists and artists will share at least some common knowledge as artists start to develop, as in this case, different pattern-making techniques using different bacteria species on petri dishes. As a type of ornamental biology, or as a type of preliminary experiment into future structures and future systems, this maintaining of the biological, the organic, and the living as components for assemblage and construction is very, very fascinating and very intriguing, because it doesn't seem to have a clear, obvious destination yet. It is not really problem solving in the conventional sense of design, and might lie closer to art than that, where it is more of exploration for the sake of exploration to see what comes up and what can be learned from the process. Neri Oxman's exhibition of material ecologies at the Museum of Modern Art showcased not simply materials, but particularly how indigenous knowledge of materials, environments, ecosystems, plant and animal interactions can be understood and applied without doing it in an instrumental or in a colonizing way. Here we start to see how systems and patterns at the small scale, how matter itself is organized according to processes. And we can start to understand that interdependency in a very profound way, even in the fine fibers and textures of the things of the world. And that these other types of knowledges might have an intrinsic power to them in the fact that a lot of the knowledges of non-Western or non-modern sciences can come out and play in the world and in many ways be a different type of nature, a second nature, an alternate nature to the one that we are taught in textbooks. So what would a world of multiple ecologies look like? I've proposed some ideas about Gardner's theories of multiple intelligence as a way of loosening up some of our assumptions and to consider the possibility of how multiplicity gives us a greater range of options and opportunities, how multiplicity can create adventures. When I lived in New Zealand, the first couple of years I was there, I was fascinated not only by the landscape, as many people are, but also by the knowledge systems constructed around it. I was told by my colleagues that because it's an oceanic civilization, that all of the fundamental principles are based on flow and change, that they don't think of things in terms of fixed, stable identities often, but even things that have souls and essences, which inhabits all of the living things, including the rocks and trees, that these are also in process, in play, in dialogue or interaction with others around them. It is not a world of static categories and singular identities. It is also not a world of right angles and orthographic shapes. It is a world where the organic and the flows and movement take on spirals and take on arabesque forms and take on a different geometrical world than the one that I was taught in my Bauhaus-based methodology as a beginning design student. I started to understand that oceanic ecologies are very different too. Subtleties of weather, the water, the clouds, the humidity patterns, even the fault lines that created all the geological activity, including earthquakes and volcanoes. All of these had a dynamic process to them. And so you start to understand the world slowly as an outsider from this point of view, this very well-established and very ancient point of view, as a different type of attitude. You don't see nature as something that is a resource to be exploited. You see yourself as a fragile part in a fragile nature with a very different ethic and a very different aesthetic. Let's consider another type of ecology, the artificial ecology. Most people won't know this, but one of the things that Charles Darwin did when he was doing his collection of samples leading up to the development of the theory of evolution was working secretly for the Royal Navy. They did a little test, a little experiment, we shall say, of creating a new world. And I'm citing here some of the philosophy I've used to analyze this. It's a type of genesis. And if you read the philosopher Alain Badeau's work on the logic of worlds, starting with any one point or any one proposition can lead to an entire complex or an entire world that's different than the one that we have. What they did here on Ascension Island, isolated in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, was Darwin took plant species from different continents that normally would never be in the same ecosystem and replanted them in this environment with the Royal Navy's consent, direction. And they left it as an experiment. It was the first type of terraforming being done with the deliberate intention to see what sort of ecologies might erupt. And it turns out the fascinating secret of this was because there was no natural water sources on the island, most of the plants couldn't survive, except at the top. At the highest height of a dormant volcano, the plants from different continents and planted together survived because of the moisture in the passing clouds. This is a cloud forest. It doesn't draw its water through the roots as much as it does from the water in the air that trickles down. If you remember the insect we started with the pieces of dew, the drops of water on its eyes, that is how these forests came to be on this Ascension Island. And it's an interesting tale because it also tells us that the pioneer of evolutionary theory, who was so well conscious of changes and transformations over time, and developed this theory without any sort of scientific knowledge of genetics per se, particularly the DNA or sequencing, came up with a very solid theory that also was context bound. The lizards he studied in the Galapagos were very different, noticeably different from the ones in the mainland in South America. And that allowed him to develop his theories. So even the subtle minimal differences that occurred that became forms of evidence for evolutionary theory can also be used in a creative way to think about how we create, and often artificially create, using artificial selection, new ecologies around us. Just introducing one new species, one new plant, or one new animal, or one new predator into an ecology can change everything. But we can also think of it from not the point of view of science, but the point of view of art. The writer Emily Dixon, who very famously said, the only cure for boredom is curiosity. And then she added, and there is no cure for curiosity. Some of the poems that she wrote were actually composed of fragments of words and samples of flowers from her garden. Like an herbarium, she would collect different elements of nature and compose and arrange them on sheets. And these are held now at Harvard in her archives as an alternative form of poetry, a poetry created by pieces of nature, spaced, composed, arranged, organized around some ideas or emotions. This is pure art and another type of bioart, I would argue, drawing from nature as a source. One of the more interesting philosophers and psychoanalysts that I've studied, I'm going to just very simply summarize some very complex theory here, but Felix Guattari pointed out, he said, we exist in three ecologies simultaneously. That we have a mental ecology. Inside our head, we have world. And this world, he said, has its own ecology. He drew on Badeson's ideas of the ecology of mind. But his argument is that one of the ecologies we occupy is a mental ecology that we are constructing and are constructed by. This is also the realm of different types of intelligences. The second we have is a social ecology, that we exist in a dynamic equilibrium with other living creatures, particularly humans. And as such, our identity and even our most secret thoughts are subtly transmitted. This is the area that emotional intelligence is exploring. And then the third, these two ecologies at different scales of the individual and the collective are also situated in a larger scale environmental ecology. And this is the natural ecology or the multiple ecologies I've been describing. So in conclusion, we've got a couple more images. I want to talk about how this works in terms of environment and design, particularly for people who are interested in interdisciplinary work with this idea of urban ecologies. If you remember in the hypothetical curriculum that we developed, urban ecologies was intended to cover everything from social relationships to cultural attitudes towards responses towards a natural environment. It's not intended to simply be artificial ecosystems, but it can be. Urban ecologies, I think, also describes the possibility of combining not just old and new, but organic and inorganic, artificial and natural. In some ways, that's also described by philosophers as a post-human condition, a transhuman condition, a machinic mind. There's a lot of terms to describe this hybridity that comes from combining things from different systems. If you think about in urban design and urban architecture, the Parc Villette competition, which Bernard Chimie won outside Paris Center, I want to look at an example of a competition entry. This was by OMA. Many design students in architecture, landscape, urbanism will know this project. They took the large complex industrial site with some existing buildings on it and divided it into conceptual strips. And you can see each of the strips here drawn as a different series of systems or as a different series of episodes. It is a type of drawing, this is a plan drawing, showing how the different parts of the park were broken into segments. And each of those segments became a different type of environment. And as the process of passing through them, whatever sequence you chose, would produce something like episodes, something like scenes in a film. So that from moving from one part of the park to another would often mean the sense of changing in the environment you were in. And by making them long and linear, narrow, and in many ways attenuated paths horizontally, as we see in plan here, east to west, any sort of diagonal movement or any sort of rotational movement would be like slicing through different layers and different ecologies. Very simple childlike drawing submitted with the competition so that everyone could understand it, showed the idea of breaking the park into different microenvironments with different rhythms, different activities, different functions. It was trying to create a band or a laminated model of other worlds, of alternative natures, of different types of escape and different types of environments. And we look at this project by Michael Sorkin. It's a project called Weed. It was the design of a hypothetical environment outside of a lake in Colorado. His weed design was a city, an imaginary city, a city that sits on the side of the lake and shows us how natural and artificial systems can come together. Unlike most urban design, this is based on the idea of entanglement, different elements and movements, the water systems, the vehicle systems, the air systems, the housing systems, the farming systems. They all move together in something that looks much more like a splash painting or something that's much more like the interplay of different movement systems through a city. You can start to see here how different trajectories, different movements, but also different zones start to overlap and intersect. You can see strong geometries around centrality. You can see all of the Bauhaus shapes, but also the organic shapes of Art Nouveau, layered, superimposed, intersecting each other, creating something that is much more dynamic than we saw in the previous design, which was much more schematic. Here, this is an environment where the natural and the artificial are all in free interplay, a sort of environment composed of multiple ecologies to allow you to have multiple subjectivities or to form different forms of intelligence about your relationship to the constantly changing parts. As a design, it meets the fundamental requirements for density, for different functions, for connective tissue and infrastructure, but it also has a playfulness to it. There's something unexpected about the composition. There's something dynamic about the fact that no one thing seems to end completely, but starts to influence the things near it. This simulates or models another understanding of how ecologies work. And one of the last drawings shows us actually a scale drawing. This is something that architects and other designers might like, taking it down to the fine level of precision of laying out exact pieces, elements, components, and organizing those in real space as a proposition for a future environment. For me, this is also part of urban ecologies because it is operating in history and outside of history. It is natural and artificial, and it is operating in a way that works at the scale of the body and also at the scale of society. And just as a little provocation at the end, this is a project in the Botanical Garden by Plan B architects, where they tried to take this, I guess, mathematical or geometrical understanding of nature and natural systems and patterns and construct an overhead canopy in the garden that simulates and dissimulates the surrounding nature. The canopy overhead, constructed of bamboo and other sustainable wood materials, floats and offers a shell or a protection. It is designed in such a way that the light filtering through it is similar, but not identical to the light that filters from the organic trees surrounding it. It is a type of oasis, but it is also a type of intervention. It shows us artificial nature and is done at such a scale that it doesn't define or cage us or place us in functional spaces. What it does is it creates an opportunity, like an umbrella. It simply covers or in some ways defines a possibility of functions and leaves the ground plane open for free movement for different sorts of mental and physical activities and different sorts of social interaction. This might seem like something far away from architecture, but increasingly architecture as a disciplinary practice is being asked to anticipate multiple futures, to respond to multiple economies, multiple ecologies, and everything from neurodiversity to unexpected future events. To design resilient environments, we have to design in the environment for the environment. And to do that, we have to use multiple forms of intelligence, multiple forms of disciplinary expertise. The design of future environments will require everyone from engineering to scientists to artists to social activists to economists to at least have some sort of common baseline and probably the same shared sense of hope or optimism and adventure that comes from some of the creative works I've shown everybody today. For me, urban ecologies is the possibility of thinking about systems and dynamic systems where there's room for creativity, where there's room for hybrids, where there's room for experimentation, but also the same fundamental understanding of the necessity of building environments where the multiple ecologies of the mental, the social, and the environmental can interact in a harmonious way, or at least in a dynamic way. I know it sounds a bit utopian and optimistic, but I think a world filled with propositional speculation like we're seeing here, or here, or here, is a world that is rich in possibilities and a world that is in the process of creating multiple worlds within it. And for that reason, I think it's very important to understand how creativity as a type of intelligence works in even the most scientific and the most rigorous of fields. And for that reason, for that to work, people who are scientific or artistic, designers, musicians, also have to understand that it's empathy, the ability to put yourself in the shoes of others. That is actually one of the fundamental human traits and the basis for all of this ethical and aesthetic work. With that, I will end my formal presentation.
Okay, thank you, Professor Micalem, for this very inspiring lecture. It's always a very big pleasure to listen to your speeches. I still encourage you to ask questions using the YouTube chat. And now it's time to start the debate, the discussion. So I would like to introduce you our guest. I would like to start with Małgorzata Kądziela from the University of Technology, from the Silesian University, who is the originator of the International Cooperation Project with Professor Thomasa Micalem. She is also the founder and main organizer of the conference entitled Senses in Architecture and Urban Landscaping. So Małgorzata is going to moderate the discussion. So now I would like to turn things over to her.
Thank you very much. I'm Małgorzata Kądziela, and this is my privilege and the pleasure to moderate a discussion that is about to take place. As we heard a moment ago, Thomas emphasized in his lecture that architectural intelligence compositionally combine elements from other disciplines into a new structure. And among those disciplines, we can find, of course, fine arts. Therefore, the organizers of the event, today's event, decided to invite a practicing artist, Agnes Mobilski, and the practicing architect, Takaharu Tezuka, to the discussion. And we are very pleased that you have accepted our invitation. Thank you very much. Among the issues that Agnes deals with in her research and artistic practice, we can find a relationship between nature, technology, common age of post-humanity, and design for the senses, as we try to connect with the consciousness around us and the non-human world. Takaharu Tezuka is now one of the most recognizable practicing architects, and his work, designed together with his wife Yui, has been awarded many times around the world. So in this discussion on architectural intelligence and multiple ecologies, Takaharu's comments will be of particular interest to us. On the one hand, because as a practitioner, Takaharu actually embodies these phenomena in his work every day. And also because we have the opportunity to hear how the phenomena discussed during the lecture function in the context of Japanese culture and Japanese architectural practice. So right now, let us give the floor to our guest, please. Agnes, would you like to start?
Is there a question?
This is a proposition, and I hope you will. Please start.
Okay. Well, I can. What my own interest in post-humanities is that my work and research departs from these deeply embodied practices, which seek a new relationship with inner nature in the coming era of post-humanity. So I found this lecture to be also very interesting in the sense of like how it discusses different types of intelligences and different types of knowledge, where we source our design choices from, and how we design for basically the human in this sort of death of the human-centric world. So, yeah, I think that we are sort of driven by this post-anthropocentric desire for self-transformation, for the emptying of the self, which could tie interesting points in with the architecture. Yeah.
Takaharu, can we ask you about the comments?
Yeah, I really I like the presentation in the Thomas. I really understand what you're talking about very much. But if I'm getting my student to understand your lecture, it takes lots of time because they're poisoned. Usually, architecture students are accustomed to analyze everything. So I can tell you how I teach the theory of which you are talking about. You know, always I talk about a cup of soup or a cup of coffee. Okay, there's a cup of soup in the old house, and when we ask on the scientist to ask the reason why the cup of soup is so tasty, they boil it and they analyze it. They try to get the amount of minerals and the calcium and the salt, all these kind of things. And then, as I said, they get a list of materials and they say, oh, maybe this is the reason why it's so tasty. But there is no answer. But if you get a very old lady, possibly your grandmother, she will tell you exactly the reason why it's so tasty. Oh, you are back from very cold outside, and you are sitting in front of old family table, and then finally, you know what you like. I made this soup. It's very simple, So I'm telling you the difference between the science and architecture. Science is a way to zoom in. It's an analysis. But the way Thomas is talking about how you can zoom out, how we can get the vision, just like you get the eyes of the God. And so it's more interactive. And when you want to understand architecture, it's very important to understand the relationship between all these different kind of in existence. So, yeah, I completely agree with you. But, I want to know how you can make yourself, make your theory to be easier for students. I understand what you're talking about, but I want to know how you teach it to students. It's always I'm having difficulty, Thomas.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I've taught over 50 design studios over 30 years in at least 8 countries. So I've had a range of experiences, and I find that the most effective techniques that I've developed over time, and the students have changed a lot, are often teaching by analogy. And so what I do is I take something from the disciplines of poetry and myth, and I use a understanding of philosophy, but not too much in the studio. And I used to teach a lot of studios where I would have the students collect abandoned materials and follow a Raoul Rauschenberg or Jean Tinguely assemblage process of, how many different ways can you put these together and why did you do that? And it became a mixture of, assemblage and psychoanalysis that way. Why does this shape feel better? Why does that? What could this do? In a sense, it started with literal material, tactile experiences, and then tried to build a knowledge of processes from that sensory data and from the resistance of some materials couldn't combine well, some would break. So they would get some, in the same way I think they learned to navigate the world, they would learn to navigate materials. And, you know, I used to get in trouble with deans for students bringing in pieces of Volkswagens and, you know, trees and things into studio, because they like the studios to be very tidy and efficient. So the process I tended to use was more of a closer to a sculpture studio, an open laboratory filled with a lot of ideas and noise and conversations, and always asking the question, what could that do? What could that do? We didn't do problem solving in the conventional sense of here's a site, here's a program, make a building. I tried to resist that to some degree because that seemed to just, you know, instrumentalize the architectural imagination as a client service. And I would tell students, you know, if your client doesn't want fire stairs, would you take them off to make the client happy? And they would say, yes, yes, of course. And I go, that's unethical. You can't take fire stairs. You know, you have to save people. But working from that haptic, tactile, material resistance towards understanding processes, towards representing processes, to chaining those processes to mental operations, and then playing with the mental operations, then they would go back down the hierarchy. So I guess I was a Platonist, that the material became the representations of materials, and then math or, you know, pure geometry at the top, because geometry was always the secret. And when they discovered geometry, they would go back to the materiality. So it was like a inductive and then deductive process for maybe the first 15 years I was teaching. So I have, most of my students worked in model, and I used to get in trouble. I get in trouble because my students would, in my class, would take photographs of their model, you know, from the top and call it the plan, and from the side and call it the elevation. And the critics would be furious, and they're like, that's not architecture. And then I moved into a realm where we would work with a binary system, because students wanted more. Later generations, particularly when digital became common, wanted to solve problems and be done. They didn't like the idea of a project being infinitely long or unresolvable. They wanted discrete things they could finish and put in their portfolio. So we started to challenge that. One first year exercise was design a staircase that meets the building codes to connect two different openings in very different places. So like a square door and a round door at different heights. So it's a technical problem. How can you combine two doors and get the people to the ground? And there's a lot of ways to do it. But then we would give them a piece of poetry from Rilke or Lorca, my two favorites, and say, design a stair that connects the two openings, but make the staircase feel like this poem. And so some of the students could design a staircase that felt like the poem, and some could design the technical. And we try to get them to work on each other, so that the more artistic and the aesthetic and the more emotive students would work with the more scientific and analytical and problem-based. And then I would teach them how, using both of those techniques, they can actually be 3 techniques, then 4 techniques, then many techniques. Because they always wanted the answer. Tell me the answer, show me the right process, what's the most efficient? And I always say, well, no, that's too easy. So part of it was getting students to resist their temptation to get it done quickly and to look for a solution. And so I've been doing that until recently. Now what I do, so in my 3rd phase of my career, now when I teach, I always teach with someone who's not an architect. And what I do, we have a dialogue or debate, and we give different advice. And then I learn from that other person, and the students observe that learning. So those are my three decades.
Yeah. Can I talk more? Can I talk?
Yeah.
Can I talk? Yeah. You know, you said secret, but always I say there is no secret because there is no truth. Truth exists because there's a kind of God to make it perfect. But this world is not perfect because everything is interactive. You know, that reminds me the sentence given by Peter Cook. Do you know Peter Cook? Peter Cook, yeah. He's a very good friend of mine. Actually, I must say he can be our mentor. And he said observation is much more important than analysis. Just instead of thinking about it, instead of finding a truth, just to observe it, okay? And I can tell you one interesting story. You know, I made a lecture in Harvard, and all students are very good. They are very clever. But one of the students said, "Oh, you know, how can I understand the kids so much? You understood so many things so nicely. You have a lot of knowledge. How do you learn about it?" So I answered him, "Do you have a girlfriend?" He said, "Yes." "Are you planning to get married with her?" "Yes, I'm about to." "So you get married, you get the kids, you understand the kids." So it's observation. And I think that that's a kind of feeling many architecture students are losing. You know, it's a common sense, okay? But at the same time, we need to be professional, okay? So it's a kind of balance we need to make. The problem is that the kids doesn't know how to have fun. They are not enjoying life enough. That's the biggest problem.
Yeah.
I think in terms of like what I find really interesting is what you mentioned with poetry and architecture, and it reminds me of David Abram and how he talks about oral storytelling in ancient traditions and its relationship to landscape and land design as well, and how oral stories and poetries and their oral traditions would follow the basically the territories that they were in, and it's sort of and so this kind of like really ties in with the post-human knowledge, I feel, and the sort of combining of different intelligences and overlaying them, but also like it comes back to re-enchantment of the world, and from as Maurice Berman talks about it, and kind of sourcing our knowledge or coming back to this ancestral and mythical and poetic sensibilities, which can help us with the sort of survival of our species also in the post-Anthropocene. Because we need to sort of come back to the embodiment, we need to come back to the body, to the somatic intelligence, and like indigenous technologies for building can also help us a lot with that. Like,
I think that's fascinating for me because I came from much more of a systems-based approach, being taught design from British high-tech refugees. My professors were students of Caen and Nice, and later Corbu. So I was third generation modernist that way. But it's only when I went to Australia and then to New Zealand that I started working with PhD students who came with very, very conscious and articulate explanations of their indigenous knowledge systems. And they would bring that to the university, and even I remember some of the students formed a rebel post-colonial and decolonizing reading group, which they refused at first, I guess, for people to find out about. And it grew so big, it became quite public and displaced the standard curriculum in place there. And to just see the power of that curiosity, but also the assertion of the different knowledge systems. And now that I'm working here in India, it's been quite fascinating from that point of view of seeing very archaic techniques and how they operate or operated. Even the stepwell design as one of the safest spaces, not a sacred space, but one of the safest spaces for women of different castes and classes to interact openly. And there's a lot of things that we see as problems that were actually solved definitively. But there's just a couple generations of break between them. One of the colleagues I worked with in Canada told me, he said everything was sustainable until industrialization, and now nothing is. And there's a little bit of truth in that overstatement too. But I also find that I work as a little bit of a consultant for an organization called Living Midnight. Two recent grads who basically construct projects around extracting or articulating obscure lost narratives from different communities, particularly repressed narratives. and turning them in everything from graphic novels to installations to landscapes. And I think this kind of, as you said, that correlation between narratives, environment, embodiment, and my background in process philosophy, I increasingly go against essentialism and identity politics because of that, because I'm optimistic about transformations. And maybe that's why I've always been attracted to surrealism and alchemy, because to me, that seemed to be the way to signal jam, the crippling functionalism that drives a lot of decisions. And Takahura, maybe you can help me with this question, because I always ask students in every country when I move to a new country, design students in particular, I say, what's better than efficiency? And very often in architecture schools, you just get blank stares. And so a lot of what I do is trying to say, how would you go about answering that question? And some of them do discover re-enchantment, and some of them discover lost traditions. We did a project in Canada quite often for third-year students, a design-build project. And we did it in collaboration with architecture students and the Cordon Bleu cooking school in Ottawa, which had a very different knowledge base and tradition. And we would have the students work together briefly, but each of the architecture students, they designed a temporary pavilion, not using any nails. They had to be able to assemble it and disassemble it within 24 hours on a heritage site. They couldn't break the ground. They couldn't bring external power supplies. So it was very austere. They had to design an environment to share a meal for 12 people, which included everyone from representatives from lighting design to the wood council. And all of the students started calling their grandmothers to get recipes, and they all learned. It got very competitive, but all of a sudden everybody sitting around the tables with these artificial temporary pavilion environments that were one-off devices. They came to understand that synergy between the environment, the sanctity, I guess, of the meal with strangers, and the efficiency of standardized parts in the construction. And it was a fascinating experience. This project had evolved. Some of the other professors had started it, and each person that took it over transformed it. But that was also the project that got a lot of the students their first job. Because I say, here, I built something. I did it with people. This is the event. This is what we learned. So it was taking observation into immersion in the educational system. And it was one of the more effective projects, because every student went into that project nervous, because they thought, I don't know anything about environment. I don't know too much about assembling things. I don't know about cooking. I don't know about lighting. And they had to figure it out on the fly, because it was a strict time. And, I shouldn't admit it as a theorist, they didn't have a lot of time for theory either. They spent a lot of time in dialogue and observation, and not just curiosity, but a little bit of competitiveness that really drew out some fascinating one-off designs. And it was a sort of project where most students don't like group projects, but that one, they said, we always came up with projects that were better than any one of us could do. And I was like, that shouldn't be such a rare thing when humans come together, but perhaps it is. And I'm very intrigued about these, I guess, the mythopoetic. That was always there for me in my education. My first lecture as a student going to undergraduate was about Plato's Cave from a retired humanities professor from Princeton. And, I walked out of that classroom saying, I love universities, this is great. And it probably imprinted on me in a very strong way. But I think maybe the challenge now is not just, because I've been recommending Escobar's pluriverse to a lot of students, and we talk about worlds within worlds and rabbit holes within rabbit holes. And not just have people understand it abstractly, but to find them and throw themselves into those rabbit holes to see what happens. And one of my PhD students in New Zealand, she goes, you have to understand Indigenous knowledge is all about rabbit holes within rabbit holes, and that there's layers of tradition, and there's embedded knowledge and wisdom in even the simplest of soups. And once I started to understand that, then architecture got hard again.
Okay. You made, actually you mentioned my name, so I have to answer. And about the functionalism, okay? Functionalism is a kind of sweet deception. And always I tell my students, Mr. Deloy and Le Corbusier, they're big liar. They're telling lie. What they're doing is not functional at all. Actually, it's a rationalism. What rationalism means, actually it's meeting their own theory, rationality. but the rationality is very, very, the personal. But as it gets more personal, it becomes more pure. Since I am a student, I have been a student in architecture field. I am very much fascinated by the design of 1960s, 1970s, especially in French. I'm a big fan of Citroën and also, Jean Prouvé, and also some interesting bicycle parts, All these are beautiful. So I researched a lot about it. And I'm driving all the Citroëns.
Nice.
And what I found out is everything looks so functional. Everything is minimal. They thought about it quite a lot. So, but always fails. It doesn't work. But the French like it. That is what Le Corbusier is about. Okay.
Style.
So when students are talking about the functionality, I tell students, okay, don't try to analyze too much, because when you think about it, always you have to make a lie. Okay, there is no truth. Actually, there is no truth in the world. So try to have your own vision, and try to have rationality just in your theory, and it will come out, okay? And some kind of answer comes out. And I don't think it's the answer is going to be functional, because one way your answer might be functional, but another way it's not functional, because the truth got many facets. But it's very important to have your own vision. Now, I like, one word you gave us, indigenous knowledge system, I think rationality also can be indigenous knowledge system, because each one is different. That is always I'm saying to my students, no, do you understand?
Okay. I think I understand.
I think like in terms of post-humanism, which means going beyond the rational subject and sort of allowing probably the ancient or traditional wisdoms and knowledge to come to the fore and instead work for us, and as we sort of go beyond the neocortex and all the logical systems that we've invented and systems that put us into sort of boxes and make us into linear, subjects, basically. And I think that's why the poetic sensibilities can return us back to like how we are actually metamorphic, how we relate to animal and mineral kingdoms, and how we can take inspiration from there. I found it really interesting when you were showing the insects and how the Maori took inspiration in all these circular geometries, etc. And I think that rationality has a lot to do with sort of this very competitive world that we live in that is sort of result oriented, etc. And I think that's what it ties it to rationalism. And then going beyond rationalism is going into this circular sort of consciousness where everything sort of recycles itself, and we're part of this relational consciousness with everything around us, right? And just like, I think when you talk about students, I think it's a lot about sourcing knowledge and inspiration and expanding the imaginary from also the languages and the knowledges that came before. And like a lot of my research, for example, is also based on like post-human rhetorics and the language and rhetorics that was used, and then how we see or perceive language today, and what kind of effect language has also on our metamorphic animal nature that we have. And then yeah, in terms of like how we survive in spaces, also through the way that we design language or use language. And
yes, yeah. And I remember having those conversations when I was a beginning student too, about how do you know the right way to do things? And even when I was at Harvard, I get frustrated because my professors would always say, well, you don't know. And, you know, that I guess that truth criteria, that's where I heard an argument that made sense, that said science tries to prove or disprove. If you follow the Lakatosh-Feyerabend debate about you can't really prove the truth with science, you can only falsify a theory or a claim. And Feyerabend's argument was actually anarchy and science belong together. His book Against Methods was the first one I read as a PhD student, and it made me challenge. You know, I had all these definitive moments from the Feyerabend book, and then reading Hegel, and then reading, you know, Panofsky, and you know, all of those. Sitting in on lectures by Jacques Derrida at Emory University, and going back and listening to naive positivists telling me that we can actually track people's thoughts by, you know, tracking their body motions and things. So it was, you know, a mystifying thing to find yourself surrounded by competing knowledge systems, almost like being in a free market and just having to claim allegiance to one or the other. And I always wanted to keep my options open. And I thought maybe the powerful position is to learn as many different knowledge systems as you can, as opposed to, you know, blindly following one. And so that's why I still feel like I'm a student, and I feel like every time I get up to give a talk like this, I keep thinking there's so much that I want to say, and there's so many questions. I could literally have gotten up and just asked questions for 60 minutes, I think, and not cover all of the ones that I've had that came since yesterday. And now that I'm getting this clever feedback from two very different places and two very different subject positions, it's making me question some of the assumptions that I've had too, because I've been focusing on nomadic knowledge systems because it's been a lifestyle for a while, and particularly with the pandemic and the foreclosure of certain travel. For example, right now the farmers are barricading the state border here, so we can't go into the next state. And, you know, mobility has gone from an absolute to a elitist position all of a sudden. And, you know, the digital displacement, we were joking beforehand about, you know, where is everyone located, and, you know, how does it actually show up? We don't know. Everyone's a different rectangle on the screen. But for me, this idea of understanding nomadism and going back to it, because that was a very seminal text, Deleuze-Guattari's argument. If you're familiar with it, they said there's two types of territories in the world. There's the smooth model, which is the model of the nomad, a fleet of ships, which corresponds, I think, very closely to the Maori cosmology. And the smooth space is like the desert or the sea. It's not based on property ownership or even fixed boundaries. And Toyo Ito was talking about that when I went to work in Tokyo and was doing his projects based on nomads. And then they oppose that with the imperial model, which I call striated space, which is about grids, tables, arrays, fortresses, hard walls, subdivisions, hierarchies. And they say that, you know, that's about territorialization, and the smooth space is deterritorializing. And the diagram that Deleuze did for the mentality of the nomad is actually the spiral, which is our favorite geometry now. Because it talks about returning, but every time you return in a spiral, unlike a planet circling, every time you return, as you come back to something, you're different and it's different. And so for me, that's been a big part of the intellectual itinerary as well, that not only going back to places from the past, like when I practiced in Chicago, I go there every 5 years to see if I've changed as much as the previous 5 years, because the city doesn't change that much. But the idea of nomadism also for me, I'm working now with some doctoral students and trying to make each student's learning process and journey calibrated and unique and customized, and based on the idea that they can plug in anywhere as a mobile intelligence unit. And to do that, you've got to be agile, and you've got to be able to code and decode other people's languages and read their body postures and the environment very quickly. And so that's where multiple intelligences becomes important for me, because I learned it intuitively, but now I'm trying to teach other people how to do that. And increasingly, even in academics, we have to be mobile. There's very little possibilities in places for people to move through systems without changing their location. So I was thinking, how can there be knowledge systems around smooth space, process philosophy, and nomadism? And that was the basis for my master's thesis. And that set me off on this anti-rational, I guess, career, in a sense. I'm just a nosy kid from Chicago that everyone thinks is a professor. And I just keep asking them, why do you think that way? And that's what I've done for most of my life, with students, with full professors, prime ministers. That's what I always ask them.
Unfortunately, I have to interrupt you because we are running out of time. We have 5 minutes actually left. So maybe it's time for making kind of summarizing. I would like to ask all of you to try to say a few words about the future of architectural intelligence.
So maybe let's start with Agnes. Could you say a few words?
Agnes?
I feel like in terms of what you last said, Thomas, and sort of, just looking into the future and having sort of speculations, I feel like the most exciting part is the sort of marriage of scientific and intuitive knowledge that we're coming towards. And I think that is sort of most exciting and holds the most possibilities for the future. But what will develop, we will see. But we can already see it happening in terms of like what we spoke about, the coming back to ancestral indigenous technologies and knowledge and integrating that with our current technologies and scientific thoughts and insights. So that would be my thought.
Okay, thank you. Takaharu?
Yeah, it's actually feeling is common between me and Thomas. And what is human? And people used to think, somehow human is different from others, but we are not different from other life form. Now, and so default means the default, the beginning of human. It's really being a part of whole system, and that's a way the way when we think about architecture. I think that's the way to go. I think it's enough for answer. Okay.
Thank you.
It was
Thomas.
Very good.
This is.
Okay, which one? Would you like to add something, Takaharu?
No. I said, your lecture is perfect. I enjoyed it. So it's yours, all yours.
Thank you very much. I think it's all about Thomas. And for Thomas, last words.
I want to thank everyone who helped organize this. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to share some things that I've thought about and some things that I'm still learning. And I'm particularly appreciative of this format of this conversation, because I could have answered that question much more easily 2 hours ago. But now that I have more questions from my colleagues here, I imagine that the future of architectural intelligences, and the reason I started working with Maggie here was we were looking at sense and the different meanings of sense, both in terms of logical sense, but also sensory perception. So the English word has a dual connotation already. But now there's other layers in sense and sense making and sensation as well. And I think my early model of architectural intelligence being architecture plus something else producing mutations or hybrids is just becoming more and more overwhelming as I realize how many other types of knowledge systems there are in the world, including non-human knowledge systems too, which I've become conscious of through some of my students' work too. So I think that the challenge is going to be, if I had my way, everyone would be doing nomadic type of doctoral investigations that were quasi-textual, quasi-spatial, quasi-diagrammatic, and spending your whole life apprenticing, not learning how to perfect the making of a shoe, but spending your whole life apprenticing how to ask a really good question. So maybe that's where I'm hoping we're headed.
Okay, thank you. We came to an end with our lecture and our time. Thank you very much to all of you. It was a great pleasure to listen to your lecture, Thomas, and to take part in this discussion with Takaharu, with Agnes, and also with Wojtek. Wojtek, I think you can officially close the discussion, close the lecture.
Yeah, I would like also to thank you, Maggie, for organizing this whole event and for inviting Thomas to participate in this program. And thank you also to Takaharu and Agnes for making time and being with us and sharing your knowledge with us and with our viewers, with students from Silesia University of Technology and students from University of Silesia and all the other participants. So thank you to all of you for being with us, and I hope to see you again in the future, because the topic that we touched today is extremely interesting, and it's something that we can talk for hours about all these interdisciplinary aspects. I'm also happy that we had some kind of an intercontinental discussion, because we had a representative of Asia, of North America, and Europe. So it was interesting to hear 3 different points of views. So once again, big thank you to all of you, and see you in the future.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Stay safe.
You too.